Welcome to Relax Story, a place where gentle stories help you leave behind the noise of the day and slowly drift into a peaceful sleep. Each soft, soothing narration is designed to relax your mind, release tension, and guide you to a deeper sense of calm within. If you enjoy the experience, don't forget to like and subscribe to stay with Relax Story every night, and feel free to leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggest a story you'd love to hear. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let Relax Story guide you into a restful deep sleep. What would happen if you woke before dawn had fully arrived, when the cold sat at the deepest point of a cycle repeated across thousands of years, when the light was only just enough to reveal that you were not in a place of safety, but lying on cold ground, within a small camp pressed close to the mouth of a cave, where old smoke still lingered low, like a trace of a night not yet entirely gone. Everything is quiet, yet not at peace, for heat, light, energy, all feel fragile, as though the slightest shift would be enough for everything to fall apart. And then your gaze settles on a single point, an adult bent low, hand gently stirring the ash, searching for something almost invisible, a remnant glow, a surviving ember. Why that act? Before any hunt has begun, before any great movement has taken shape, because the entire day rests upon that small answer, whether the ember still lives or has already gone dark. If it lives, the fire will return almost at once. If not, everything must begin again from the beginning, from time, from effort, from risk. Around you, a few children curl closer to the faint warmth. Others are present only through the softest of sounds, as though the whole camp is waking not to act, but to ask whether the system still holds. Could it be that a day does not begin with triumph, but with the prevention of collapse, not hunting in order to survive, but first preserving what remains stable, and only then moving toward anything else, a quiet cycle, repeated each day without announcement. So if they were not hunting all day, how did the rest of time unfold across the countless versions of a day that was never written down? Perhaps the first thing to loosen is the simplest illusion of all, the one that makes us believe the phrase early humans points to a single figure, standing somewhere outside of history, repeating the same morning, the same gesture, the same rhythm of life across uncounted millennia. But the past was never so still. Even the span of time held within that phrase stretches across a depth of the Pleistocene that is almost impossible to grasp. From populations of Homo erectus living from around 1.89 million years ago to roughly 110,000 years ago, through the communities of Neanderthals who adapted with remarkable resilience to the harsh environments of Western Asia and Europe, to the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa around 300,000 years ago, gradually expanding into many other lands. When you look into that span, a quiet but essential truth begins to take shape, that what we call prehistoric humans was never a single character, but many populations separated by hundreds of thousands, sometimes more than 1 million years, living beneath different skies, among different herds, across different terrains, with different tools, different shared memories, and different forms of social life. And so, a day for Homo erectus upon the open landscapes of Africa or early Eurasia could hardly resemble a day for Neanderthals within the colder environments of glacial Europe, where wind, season, frost, and the pressure to retain heat could slip into even the smallest decision. And it would differ again from a day of Homo sapiens toward the end of the Pleistocene, when ranges had widened, networks of connection had shifted, and symbolic capacities had begun to leave clearer traces behind. There may be the same act of waking before the first light, the same encounter with hunger, cold, fatigue, fear, or waiting. Yet what surrounds those mornings was never the same. Time had changed too much, and when time alters so deeply, the living space of those who move within it cannot be compressed into a single backdrop. Try placing those landscapes beside one another, slowly, carefully. The East African savanna opens into grasslands and distant sightlines, where water determines movement, determines where one looks, determines whether one stays or leaves. The caves of southern Africa tell a different rhythm, where darkness, draughts of wind, moisture, entrances, stone floors, and the very shape of shelter define safety in another way entirely. The Levant emerges as a bridge between Africa and Western Asia, where corridors of movement create patterns of meeting, dispersal, return, transformation, unlike any region enclosed within a single landscape. Glacial Europe is different again, different almost to the point of speaking another language of life, where low temperatures, cold winds, harsh seasons, and the pressure of warmth can bend the course of an entire day. In one place, water is the first concern. In another, shelter stands before all else. Somewhere, distance and visibility are advantage. Elsewhere, darkness decides who remains until morning. It was not only that prehistoric humans lived differently, but that each landscape compelled them to solve the same problem through entirely different combinations, as though nature never offered the same equation twice, even while the central question remained the same: survival. Yet if everything were only different, the past would dissolve into fragments with no connection. What is striking is that beneath those differences, there remains a deeper layer that binds these communities together, not through a fixed schedule, but through variables that return again and again, quietly, persistently, almost every morning: energy, water, fire, children, the sick or the injured, predators or other forms of danger, the level of social coordination within the group. A camp with children cannot move as a group of adults alone might, unburdened, more mobile, less bound by the need to carry, to soothe, to feed, to watch. A place that still holds embers from the night before enters the morning with a different rhythm from one that must build fire again from nothing, for the simple fact of warmth already changes the pace of everything that follows. A group passing through for a single night does not resemble one that has remained for weeks. Just as a site near water never presents the same pressures as one that must travel far before reaching the first source. Here, distant archaeology becomes suddenly close, so close it no longer feels like a matter of ancient strata, but of an ordinary morning. Is there still warmth? Is there still water? Who must be cared for first? What remains usable around the camp? Should today extend outward or conserve strength? Should movement be divided or kept together? What must be repaired, preserved, extinguished, avoided? What unites these communities was never that they woke to do the same thing at the same hour. What unites them is that they all had to manage risk, energy, and relationships within conditions without electricity, without stable stores, without agriculture as a foundation, without permanent structures to shield them from change. This was not a life of continuous adventure. It resembled something more fragile, a system held in balance, where each small decision rests upon another like thin layers of ash, seemingly insignificant, yet remove one layer and all warmth may be lost. To see this more clearly, we often turn to hunter-gatherer communities recorded in the modern world, yet that mirror is only useful when held with care. The Hadza of northern Tanzania are not a preserved past in untouched form. The Juhwansi of Namibia and Botswana are not a doorway directly into the mornings of all early humanity. Their value lies not in being replicas, but in revealing principles. We see sharing as a mechanism that prevents the group from fracturing. We see movement shaped by resources rather than fixed schedules. We see small camps, decisions constrained by ecology and social ties. Childcare not as the burden of a single individual, but as something woven into a network. Environmental knowledge not abstract, but practical, almost inseparable from each step taken. Even there, diversity remains immense. There is no single, unified bushman, no unchanging San model, no original version from which all others are mere variations. That truth once again draws our vision away from the habit of simplification, reminding us that the human past is not a still image, but a multitude of adaptations to conditions that never cease to change. When those overly simple labels fall away, what remains becomes smaller, closer, and far more real. No longer a continent, no longer hundreds of thousands of years, no longer the great names of human evolution, only a question, deeply human, almost modest, yet perhaps more real than any romantic vision of distant hunts. If there is no electricity, no stored food, no stove, no permanent shelter, no surplus to waste, then what is most likely to occur in the morning within a hunter-gatherer camp? Perhaps not the rush outward to hunt, perhaps not any heroic act so favoured by modern imagination. Perhaps the first act is something far more grounded, to see whether the system of survival still holds, whether warmth remains in any measure, whether the night has passed without taking away what matters most. All of prehistory, stretched across vast time and geography, suddenly narrows into a small image, a low fire in the first light of day, a bed of grey ash, a few dim embers, a fragile signal that this place has not yet gone entirely dark. If there is any morning act more likely than all our imagined hunts, it may not lie out there across grasslands or ice winds, but here, at the centre of the camp, within ash, within ember, within the last quiet breath of warmth left behind by fire. Just before dawn truly touches the rim of the earth, when light is still no more than a thin silver veil seeping through the cold air, the question that hangs over the camp is not which animal will be pursued today, nor how far the feet will travel, but something far smaller, far lower, far closer to the ground. Is the fire still alive, in a small shelter tucked near the mouth of a cave, or in an open camp ringed by wind-breaking stones and roughly stacked branches? The ash from the night before lies still as if dead, pale and cold at the surface, yet perhaps beneath it there lingers a faint ember, a fragile warmth, a memory of the night that has not yet agreed to fade. And perhaps it is in moments like these that prehistoric life reveals itself most clearly, not as a chain of adventures, but as a delicate system held together by tasks so small that no one would think to call them heroic. Across the hundreds of thousands of years of the Middle Pleistocene, in many different dwelling places, concentrated burn areas have left traces clear enough to suggest that fire did not merely flare and vanish, but often remained as a physical centre, a point toward which bodies, work, food, darkness, warmth, and safety all gathered and circled. Evidence of in-place burning in a cave in what is now South Africa around 1 million years ago, and clusters of charred seeds, burnt wood, and heat-altered flint in the Jordan Valley around 790,000 years ago, all seem to whisper the same quiet truth. Fire was there early, not only as a natural phenomenon to be seen, but as a part of lived space, tended, returned to, repeated. And so the morning does not begin with hurried steps, but with a bending of the body. You see an unnamed adult kneeling low beside the bed of ash, using the tip of a stick to gently stir, or a hand long accustomed to heat to feel beneath that grey or cooling layer. It does not matter who they are, for it is precisely their anonymity that reveals the nature of the work. What sustains history rarely bears a name. It is foundational labour, repeated so often it loses any trace of grandeur, yet without it, an entire day may slip out of order. Near that small field of warmth are children, smaller bodies that lose heat more quickly, drawn closer for comfort, then eased away again to escape thick smoke and drifting sparks. A short distance away, someone clears around the hearth, pushing aside scattered material so the heat does not wander. Another lifts their head to read the wind, for a slight change is enough to drive smoke into the sleeping space, stinging eyes, tightening chests, altering the very way the camp wakes. And someone else walks to the edge of the camp, where the ground still holds the damp memory of night, reading what has just been written there by animal feet, by unfamiliar movement, by an unusual stillness at the boundary between shadow and light. In that early hour, the environment itself seems almost present as a living thing. The wind decides where the smoke will go. The moisture decides whether dry branches will accept flame. The chill of the morning sets the urgency of every small gesture. Fresh tracks, a brittle crack in low brush, or a silence that lingers longer than it should may all suggest that the land around the camp is safer this morning, or less so. And so the entire morning unfolds as a quiet ritual, slow, low, sparse in words, repeated day after day, yet carrying a meaning that, when seen closely enough, can scarcely be called anything other than survival. The first task is to test the ash. Is there still a red point beneath the grey, or has everything gone dark in the night? If there is, the next step is not to heap fuel upon it in a decisive act, but to tend it with rhythm, as if lifting a fragile creature back into the world. First the smallest things, dry and light and ready to catch. Then the larger branches, thicker, slower to burn. A touch too much, a moment too fast, and the ember may choke and die beneath the very weight meant to save it. Meanwhile, the camp wakes through many small movements unfolding at once, like the limbs of a single body. One person draws a child away from the smoke, another adjusts where things lie, where bodies rest, where tools are kept. One remains at the edge, reading the ground, the shadow of grass, the faint imprint newly pressed into damp soil. A morning begins not with a call, but with this quiet coordination. But what if the ash holds nothing at all? What if beneath the grey there is only cold, only dust, only an ending? Then the rhythm of the morning shifts at its root. Everything is colder, slower, more demanding. Keeping children warm becomes harder. Preparing food is delayed. The beginning of all other work must wait. A day does not collapse at once because the hearth has died. Yet it is dragged downward, as though the entire camp must begin from a lower ground. And perhaps this is the deepest message left behind by ancient burn traces. Not only that distant ancestors knew fire, but that they learned to live around specific centres of activity, where fire binds one task to another, night to morning, body to order. And so what deserves attention is not the towering flame, but the small coal that almost no one looks at closely. Fire gives heat so the body can endure the cold of early hours and cooler lands. Fire gives light so the day does not end too soon when the sun falls. Fire shapes a sense of safety around the place of sleep. Fire becomes, gradually, a point of gathering, where work, sharing, preparation, and rest find a common centre. Yet deeper than these visible benefits lies a quieter transformation. Fire reshapes the day itself. When it lives, the camp can extend outward in many directions. Some go to gather fuel, some prepare foundational food, some care for children, some mend tools, some move beyond the dwelling to work farther away. When it dies, all these branches slow from the beginning, as if the day must take a longer path to recover what should have already been there. Could it be that the history of our species, in a quiet sense, has been carried by such small acts? Not by rare, extraordinary moments, but by the steady repetition of gestures close to the ground, close to ash, close to breath. When the hearth returns to life, the camp gains more than warmth, it regains order. Only then do thoughts extend toward longer fuel, more certain food, the care of children, the repair of things, the possibility of moving farther from shelter. What seems to come first, the hunt, often does not stand at the head of the day. What comes first is the quiet stabilization of the most fragile conditions, so that the day may begin without breaking from itself. From that circle of warmth just preserved, another question slowly emerges as light spreads across the ground. If an ordinary day does not truly open with heroics, then what, quietly, fills most of the hours of the early human life? When the morning fire has been steadied, when warm ash still breathes beneath its covering, and the light is enough for human forms to separate from the circle of the camp, what opens ahead is not a dramatic rush, but a quiet branching, so familiar it begins to resemble a wordless ritual. By the edge of a lake, around 23,000 years ago, there is a small settlement of brush huts, hearths, and living surfaces that still hold the traces of everyday life as if time has only just withdrawn. Water is near, fish are near, birds are near, soft stretches of earth that can be opened to find edible roots and tubers are near, seeds, fruits, wild plants, things that arrive with the seasons and vanish with them, are near. Perhaps this is the true shape of abundance in prehistory, not a single large prize, but many small possibilities scattered around the place of living, waiting to be noticed, waiting to be remembered. And so the camp divides. Some leave carrying baskets or digging tools. Some move along the water's edge, where mud, low grass, and the shadow of birds may hint at what the day allows. Some remain near the hearth, not because they stand outside the work of sustenance, but because sustenance has never belonged only to what lies beyond the camp. Food from the day before still needs to be handled again, cleaned again, arranged again. One set of hands tends the fire, another watches the children, another repairs what has worn down over many days of use. All unfolds at once, slow, even quiet, like streams branching from a lake and finding their way back again. Food seeking here does not take the form of a single charge. It takes the form of a quiet network of movement, spreading, returning, and spreading again. As the gaze lowers closer to the ground, what appears is not glory, but memory. The memory of the body that knows where to bend, what kind of soil to read, which bush to pause before. The memory of the landscape, where each season leaves behind a faint map, not written in words, but in the repetition of rain, retreating water, ripening fruit, hidden hives, and paths worn by many steps. Was that life truly sustained by heroic acts, when so much of the morning seems to pass through small journeys, small choices, things gathered that seem too small to become myth? The central figures of that morning resist rigid framing, as though the world were governed by a simple formula. Small groups leave to gather foundational foods, and within them there may be women, older children, sometimes men, depending on what the landscape offers and what the day requires. Others remain, yet to remain is not to be idle. Tending fire, caring for children, repairing tools, processing what has already been brought back, all are inseparable parts of the same system. What feeds the camp does not come only from afar, but from the ability to transform what is already present into something usable, edible, extendable for another measure of time. What is sought does not always appear memorable. Tubers, roots, seeds, fruits, honey, small animals, fish, birds, foods that come and go with the seasons, yet return if remembered at the right moment. Where organic traces endure clearly enough, they reveal a life not built upon a single source. Many kinds of plants appear alongside small animal remains and aquatic resources, as though the entire economy of the camp were woven from many fine strands rather than one heavy rope. And this suggests a quiet but powerful truth. These less celebrated foods are often more repeatable, more predictable, less risky. They do not promise a moment of eruption. They promise a day that can reach its end. For gathering food has never been a single verb. It is a long sequence of seeing, remembering, choosing, walking, carrying, and returning. Some move towards soft ground to uncover what lies beneath. Some follow the margins of water or brush, searching for seeds, fruits, hives, small fish, the subtle signals of a season unfolding. Each decision calls upon a deep but quiet memory. When does each thing appear? Where did fruit grow last year? Is the distance worth the return? What should be carried today for digging, for holding, for wrapping, so that effort is not lost along the path home? Should one go a little farther or remain a little closer? The questions are never dramatic, yet for that very reason they matter. A great mistake in a large hunt may be easily told. A chain of correct judgments in daily gathering is what keeps life from breaking its rhythm. What is brought back rarely takes the shape of a symbol, not a single object large enough to halt the camp in wonder. Usually only a little of this, a little of that, a little honey, a few fish, some fruits of the right season, a little, a little, a little. And yet it is this accumulation that holds the secret of stability. These small things continue another life once they return. Seeds and fruits do not end at the moment they are found. They are worked upon again on the living surfaces around the hearth, cleaned, separated, ground, prepared for eating or for keeping. Food does not remain outside life and then enter as a finished prize. It follows a longer path, slower, closer to accumulated labour than to a single moment of possession. To see this slow rhythm more clearly, one might look toward mobile foraging communities in eastern Africa, around Lake Eyasi, where small camps do not remain fixed, where members move in and out with flexibility, where the entire group often shifts position after 6 to 8 weeks as nearby resources thin. This is not a window open directly into the past, nor a perfect mirror of a world 23,000 years ago, yet it makes something essential easier to see. A day of subsistence need not be organised around a single hunt stretching from morning to dusk. In quantitative observations of women's foraging activity, time spent outside the camp for this work occupies a substantial portion of the day, suggesting a daily rhythm of 4 to 5 hours, long enough to structure the day, yet too steady to become legend. Studies of movement also show that daily distance varies with resource density, with the type of food pursued, with the risks and opportunities of terrain. Each day becomes a small problem, each journey a short cycle, each decision a negotiation with the landscape. From that ancient lakeshore to more recent mobile camps, a quiet conclusion begins to take shape, stronger for never needing to be declared. What carries a community through most of its days is not the large kill, but the steady flow of small calories, not the shining moment, but repetition, not the myth of a single success, but environmental memory precise enough to assemble many small units into collective life. And perhaps this is the most remarkable thing. The greatness of prehistory may not lie in the heroism that modern imagination favours, but in a patience deep enough to trust small things, enduring enough to return to them each day, wise enough to understand that a community does not live on glory, but on steadiness. And yet, if these quiet streams of calories form the foundation of most days, where does hunting truly sit within this landscape? And why is it that this, rather than that steady and silent rhythm, clings so tightly to our imagination? The background data used to anchor this section in time, place, and patterns of life has been cross-referenced from descriptions of Ohalo 2, studies of plant preparation around hearths at the site, and anthropological and ecological observations of mobility among the Hadza around Lake Eyasi. Hunting was real, its importance was real, and at times it could decide whether a day held together or came apart. But the familiar image of it is often too neat, too brightly lit, too much like a framed scene rather than a reality stretched across long hours, across many tracks, across many pauses in silent ground, from the Middle Stone Age in Africa to the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, across open grasslands, forest edges, wind-beaten uplands, and semi-arid country where the earth kept its traces only for a brief span of morning. Hunting appears not as a sudden burst of action, but as a form of survival knowledge, slow, cold, exacting, a world in which life sometimes depended on seeing what almost no one else could see, on reading what the ground said only in its faintest voice, and on understanding that there were moments when pressing on was wise, and moments when turning back was the only thing that kept the body whole. What remains from different archaeological settings suggests something equally clear, that hunting was not the privilege of a supposedly more modern kind of human in any simple sense, because both Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans could carry out intricate strategies, which means that behind any hunt there was not only strength, but memory of the land, knowledge of season, of animal movement, of the narrow distance between opportunity and accident. And it is there that the familiar illusion begins to dissolve. Hunting did not mean going out, spotting an animal, rushing forward, and bringing it down in one clean and direct line. Most of the time, a hunt contained no climax at all. It was the slow walk over ground not yet fully warmed. It was the pause to listen for a sound as thin as thread. It was the moment of crouching down to study whether the edge of a footprint was still fresh or already drying, whether dung still held moisture or had already changed colour, whether grass had been dragged flat in one direction, and then weighing it, letting it go, and moving on again. Perhaps it is precisely because it did not always shine in the way modern imagination wants it to, that hunting is so often told badly. It is compelling because it carries risk. It is compelling because at times a single success could alter the rhythm of eating for an entire small group, and for that very reason. It could never have been the only foundation beneath every day of life. Once the drama is stripped away, what remains is not pure courage, but a sequence of practical calculations so cold they almost sting. In that landscape, the characters were not only the hunting party and the animal under pursuit. The terrain was a character too. Water was a character too. Wind was a character too. And the probability of failure, though invisible, moved beside every decision like a shadow. The people involved in a hunt, then, should not be imagined as a fixed company of men repeated unchanged across every place, every time, every community. What was most stable, in fact, was variation itself, depending on whether the target was small game or large, depending on the distance to be covered, the lay of the land, the condition of the camp. The people who took part could change, just as hunter-gatherer life itself was always more flexible than the old diagrams once wanted to make it. The prey might be deer along a forest edge, antelope across open grass, wild horses in cooler country, or other medium and large animals depending on the place. But what matters is not the name. What matters is their nature. They were fast. They were alert. They could smell danger before human eyes had fully adjusted to the light. They could run for miles. They could injure the one pursuing them in a matter of seconds. Such an animal was not merely a possible source of meat. It was also a test of whether the hunt was worth beginning at all. Was the ground sloping or level? Did mud preserve tracks or swallow them? Would the sun burn away strength before noon? Would the wind carry human scent ahead? Was there enough water left for the return? Was the camp too far from here if one had to drag back a heavy load, or a wounded body? Hunting in its truest form began with a problem like that. And that problem led into a chain of actions far longer than any illustration of a single thrown spear would ever suggest. First came the reading of tracks, not only to know that the animal had passed, but to guess its speed, its direction, whether it was alarmed or at ease. Then came the dung, the broken grass, the the freshly turned soil, each small fragment joined into an invisible movement. Then came listening, because some hunts were decided by a sound smaller than footsteps. Should the pursuit continue or not? How far before stopping? Was there strength enough for the journey back? How much water remained? Was the spear point loose? Was the shaft cracked? Everything had to be considered before any close approach could happen at all. And perhaps what modern imagination finds hardest to accept is the truth that many such journeys ended with nothing brought home. Quantitative data from more recently observed hunter-gatherer communities suggest that hunting returns, especially from large game, fluctuated sharply, and that empty-handed trips were so common they were nearly a normal part of the system. The difference between hunters did not always lie in the size of the reward when they succeeded, but in how often they failed. At that point, hunting was no longer a story of constant victory. It became the art of entering uncertainty and accepting that uncertainty often refused to yield. And so, many hours of a hunt were in fact made of silence, of waiting, of judgment, of hesitation, of the moment one decided to give up before the body had gone too far, before the sun had fallen too low, before thirst became a greater danger than the animal ahead. That was not excessive caution, it was ecological lucidity. Large game might promise a large reward, but because its variability was so great, it could never by itself create a stable rhythm for the whole community. To survive the days without meat, there had to be sharing. There had to be other sources, less glamorous perhaps, but more dependable. There had to be other kinds of work, quieter perhaps, but steadier. And for that reason, the old picture of who naturally hunted must also be kept open. For a very long time, people grew used to imagining the past as though all of human evolution had been carried by a single division. Men hunted, women gathered. That image endured not because it was always true, but because it was too convenient, too tidy, too well suited to what many eras wished to believe about themselves. Yet when one looks more closely at ethnographic data and recent reviews, the picture becomes far more flexible. There are societies in which women are recorded as taking part in hunting, sometimes regularly, sometimes depending on context, on prey type, on the specific needs of the group. That does not mean every older model was wholly wrong, and it does not mean every community was the same. What ought to remain is only a necessary caution, that hunting varied with society, with environment, with purpose, with circumstance, and that any rigid law imposed across the whole history of humanity risks flattening a prehistoric reality far more complex than that. When the last glow has been lowered, what remains appears both simple and profound. Hunting is compelling precisely because it could not be the sole foundational labour of every day. It demanded knowledge, patience, endurance, the ability to bear failure, the instinct to retreat at the right moment, the acceptance that there were days when the earth gave nothing at all except dust, wind, and tracks fading beneath the sun, the very thing that makes it shine in modern imagination, its drama, its danger, this sense that one success could change the meal of the group, is also what made it too unstable to carry the whole of communal life from one day to the next. It was a strategic gamble, not the level ground beneath existence. And perhaps the real question lies not in the moment when a weapon met its mark, but in the moment just after, when the animal was no longer a distant shape among wind and grass, but became meat, bone, hide, marrow, a weight that had to be carried, work that had to be done, an obligation that had to be shared, as dense piece of reality suddenly fallen into the fragile rhythm of the camp. And from there another question rose slowly into view, whether after the killing, the real work had only just begun. The animal had fallen, but that was never the true ending. It was only the moment when labour changed its shape, from the tension of pursuit into the quieter burden of processing, carrying, deciding, a burden less dramatic, yet longer, more draining, and closer to the truth of life itself. In many late Paleolithic camps, life did not drift past as some dim and chaotic blur, but often left behind rather clear traces of order, of hearths, of sleeping places, of spaces reserved for handiwork, of corners where material was cut, separated, repaired, stored, and left waiting. At Ohalo, too, on the shore of the Sea of Galilee around 23,000 years ago, habitation space seems already to have carried that logic within it, a logic that says very softly that life is not preserved by grand moments, but by the way a group places the right task in the right place at the right time. And so, after the animal's collapse, what began was not the meal, but the invisible clock of spoilage, of distance, of blood scent moving through the wind, of a question tightening by degrees where to process it, what to carry, what to leave behind. At this point, the characters in the story are no longer only the one who cast the spear or the one who followed the tracks. Before you stand many different hands, many different breaths, many roles appearing almost at once. Someone kneels beside the still warm body, stripping away the softer flesh first, cutting tendon, opening the viscera, touching the most perishable parts with the calm urgency of one who knows that time always defeats meat if the hand is too slow. Someone else stands a little higher, eyes sweeping the edge of the grass, the rim of stone, the line of shadow, as though darkness itself might move, because a large carcass rarely belongs to one group alone in the wild. It calls to others, to those who scent, to those who wait for chance, to those who do not hunt and yet arrive at exactly the right moment. Someone is already thinking of the road back to camp, of load weight, of which shoulders still have strength, of who should go first and who should remain. And back at the shelter, others who have not yet seen the prey are already living inside its rhythm, tending the fire, clearing space, preparing the ground, preparing the stones, preparing the empty place into which a great mass of matter is about to pour itself into the life of the whole group. The prey itself becomes a heavy and difficult character, a mass more complicated than its outward form suggests. It is too heavy to carry whole in every case. It is uneven, because some parts hold more energy, some spoil faster, some matter not because they can be eaten at once, but because they can bind, wrap, cover, stretch, join, and hold. Some things must be taken first, because by tomorrow it will be too late. Some can wait a few hours, but only a few. Some are worth the risk of returning for. Some are worth accepting the loss of. And what decides those choices? Not one single rule, not one simple instinct, but an entire survival calculation made swiftly in the mind, including terrain, weather, distance, number of carriers, the size of the animal, the risk that the rest will be stolen, even the obligations already waiting at camp. And so the first thing after the hunt is not eating. The first thing is a wordless counsel. in which every gaze is already dividing the animal into decisions. From that scene, the true logistics begin. Should it be processed there on the spot, or should the group try to drag the whole body back? Should the best portions be taken first, or should the load be divided in order to preserve more? Should the long bones be kept, or should softer meat take priority? The larger the animal, the less simple the answers become. If the road home is long, if the ground is broken, if the weather is cold but not cold enough to preserve everything, if the group is small, if there are children, elders, or the weak in camp who need food quickly, each variable presses one more layer of weight onto the choice. Most likely, the softest and most perishable parts are dealt with first. Organs must be decided upon quickly. Fat must be noticed. Hides must be kept if they still hold value as covering or clothing. Tendons may become the thing that binds other things together in the days ahead. Long bones in dry or cold regions of the Paleolithic world were not merely the hard remains left after a meal, but could be vessels for a dense form of energy, a quiet richness of fat as precious as a promise carried through lean seasons. And perhaps it is here that hunting changes its name without anyone needing to say it, from strategy into logistics, from pursuit into the management of loss, from victory into a chain of trade-offs. When the first parts are brought back to camp, the biological story almost immediately becomes a social one. Meat is no longer merely protein, no longer merely reward, no longer merely an object laid down beside the fire and ending there. It enters a space that already has order, where the hearth lies in one place, where working hands gather in another, where resting bodies retreat to somewhere else, as though the whole camp has been arranged to receive returning matter and turn it into life. Some portions are cut again, some must be smoked early, some are set aside to break bone for marrow, some sinew is kept as though its future belongs to a task not yet arrived. Some hide will not become supper, but a layer between the body and the cold wind. An animal, then, does not become only food. It becomes a long chain of uses, of salvage, of almost refusing to let anything vanish completely. And then another question rises, quieter but deeper. Who receives which part? Who eats first? Who is given priority? Do those who did not directly join the hunt still receive a share? Do children, the old, the weak, reach the softer portions, the easier ones to eat? In many hunter-gatherer societies, large game does not end with the one who struck it down. In Tanzania today, where the Hadza still preserve many ancient patterns of sharing, large portions of meat often spread through the distribution networks of the whole group, as though its value lies not in personal ownership, but in its power to tighten, soften, and maintain a social structure that is always fragile. Why would that be? Perhaps because sharing reduces risk across uncertain days. Perhaps because sharing creates prestige. Perhaps because sharing is the way a group reminds itself that no one survives for long alone. Or perhaps because all of these things are partly true at once. As so many great truths of prehistory often seem to be, half in light and half in shadow. And it is here that what first seemed like mere logistics suddenly reveals another face. It is politics, but politics at the scale of a small camp, of a few hearths, of the glances exchanged when meat is laid down. A successful kill can generate gratitude. It can also generate silent debt. It can raise someone standing without a word being spoken. it can just as easily sow resentment if distribution is felt to lean the wrong way. If fairness begins to crack because one piece of meat goes to the wrong place. The group's unwritten rules are rarely carved in stone, yet they appear with startling clarity in moments like these, in the way portions are given, in the way people wait, yield, remember who has brought what back for whom. And so what mattered was never only what had been killed. What mattered was what the whole group did with it afterward, how it was processed, how it was divided, how that brief victory was turned into lasting stability. By this point, a slow recognition begins to emerge, deep as marrow within bone. Even when the hunt succeeds, what keeps a group alive through many seasons is not meat alone. Beyond the meat are smaller tasks, quieter tasks, tasks less often remembered, yet perhaps filling far more hours of human life, from processing plants, softening, grinding, drying, preparing food for elders and children, to transforming the rough things brought in from the outer world into something the body can truly receive. And when the sound of bone breaking slowly falls away, when the most perishable parts have already been dealt with, another question begins to step out from the shadows, slowly, like smoke rising from a hearth. How much of ancient life, in the end, was given not to the moment of bringing an animal down, but to the much longer and quieter labour of turning everything brought home into actual food. There is truth so simple that it nearly vanishes from the modern imagination. Bringing food back to camp does not yet mean there is something to eat. At Ohalo, too, along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, also known as Lake Kinneret, some 23,000 years ago, small groups may have returned with tubers, roots, seeds, fruits, and clusters of tiny grasses gathered from the lakeside landscape. Yet, that moment was not the end of subsistence, only the beginning of another layer of labour, slower, quieter, almost soundless. It is not a distant blur of prehistory, but a camp of brush huts, of hearths, of living floors preserved with rare clarity by waterlogged conditions, where the mud held even the most fragile traces, revealing that daily life did not end with bringing something in from the outside, but continued upon the ground where people sat, slept, touched stone, touched fire, touched things that were not yet truly food. A freshly dug tuber might still be fibrous, still resistant, still a burden for the stomach. A seed newly gathered might still carry husk and dust, still require cleaning, grinding, roasting. A plant part acceptable for the strong might be too coarse for a child, too hard for the aged, too heavy for the weakened. And so one might wonder, is it here, within that narrow distance between what is brought back and what can sustain a body, that most of a day begins to dissolve, slowly, steadily, without leaving a trace of sound? For when food remains in its raw state, it is not yet truly food, and so the rhythm of the camp must slow, allowing nature to be transformed by hand, by stone, by fire. The central figures of this moment have no names, do not stand out against the open land, but sit for long stretches beside the hut floor, beside the hearth, beside the working surface, repeating movements so small that from afar they might scarcely seem like actions at all. Only hands occupied with peeling, crushing, grinding, sifting, drying, softening. Children are very near. The elderly are there as well. They're not necessarily those who brought the raw plants back, yet their presence reshapes the work itself. For what can be eaten by one may not suit another. What can be swallowed by an adult may not be safe for fragile teeth or a body worn by time. Tubers, roots, seeds, fruits, plant parts with tough skins or difficult textures thus become not merely food, but resistant materials. Materials that do not yield into nourishment unless human hands intervene long enough, patiently enough, repeatedly enough. At Ohalo too, across the different living surfaces of Brush Hut, one concentrations of seeds and fruits alongside plant processing areas suggest this was no minor task, no passing improvisation. In one lower layer alone, some 55,000 seeds and fruits were found, with hearths in one level and grinding stones in another, as though living space itself had been arranged so that plant processing could unfold day after day. Tools that appear simple, a grinding slab, a basalt working surface, a flat anvil, a hearth, perhaps rough containers, begin to tell another story of these people. They did not merely eat what they gathered, but intervened deeply into the material structure of what they brought back, as though life always required one more step, and then another. And so, once food returned to camp, the story had only begun again on another plane, quieter yet longer. The first task was sorting, and that sorting may have needed no words, for the hands already knew which things could be eaten almost at once, which should be set aside, which required careful preparation before reaching the mouth. What followed was a chain of actions repeated so often that they took on the form of ritual more than labour removing outer layers, breaking apart, grinding into smaller pieces, applying heat to soften, drying to reduce moisture, airing to preserve, sometimes soaking, sometimes discarding what should not be eaten. What is striking is that at Ohalo too, such gestures are not merely imagined, but align with traces of plant processing areas on living floors, as well as evidence that wild cereals were deliberately handled. Analysis of starch grains adhering to stone tools shows selected wild cereals passed through grinding, while traces of a simple oven-like hearth suggest that flour from ground seeds may have been baked, a form of processing that appears long before the domestication of crops in Southwest Asia, by at least 12,000 years, and that reshapes the entire image of a prehistoric day. It is not always about going far. It is not always about pursuing something in motion. Many hours may have passed beside fire, beside stone, beside the ground, within movements so slow they might be forgotten by history, even though it is there that nature gradually becomes edible. From there, plants no longer remain a blurred green backdrop behind human life, but emerge as materials with their own structure, their own resistance, a quiet stubbornness that compels time to be spent in breaking them open. Seeds have hard shells, tubers have tough fibres, some plant parts contain raw starch, difficult to chew, to digest, to transform into something gentle for the body. Only when stone takes part, only when fire takes part, only when time is added, do they begin to change. And perhaps this is the deepest point of the story, that food is not only found, but must be made again through effort. The needs of the body are present in every motion. Children require softness, the elderly require ease, the weakened require safety. Not everything gathered outside can become a shared meal at once. At Ohalo too, the placement of plant processing traces directly on living floors, close to where people sat, slept, worked, makes this clearer than ever. Plant processing is not at the margins of life, but at its centre, within the space of warmth, of ash, of hands constantly adjusting the world so the body can receive it. Within that rhythm of repetition, the seemingly vast question of what early humans did all day begins to shift in tone. Many times, the answer does not lie out there in the open land, but in the act of sitting in one place and turning what has been brought back into something that can sustain someone. Human history, seen this way, is not built only from long journeys, hunts, crossings of vast landscapes, but is held up by stretches of stillness and repetition, stretches so lacking in spectacle they become nearly invisible. Yet they support the life of the camp like submerged posts beneath water. Perhaps this is the oldest form of labour in its deepest sense, not conquering the world, but patiently softening it, not breaking nature in a single violent moment, but little by little, turning its resistance into nourishment. Around this process, small eyes must have been very near. They watched, they imitated, they touched. They asked with their gaze before asking with words, and so skill was not only made, but passed on within the same space, among grinding stones, among warm ash, among hands working so slowly it seemed as though nothing was happening. And if so many hours of a day were spent there, beside fire, beside stone, within those small movements that softened the world, then perhaps the quietest question is no longer what people ate, but what the children sitting closest to all of this were learning from that long, unbroken slowness. While adults bent over hearths, over raw materials, over unfinished food and tasks so small yet so necessary, children were already there, so near that no true boundary separated them from the domain of knowledge. For in foraging societies such as the Hadza of Tanzania or the Bayaka of the Congo Basin, what is called learning does not occur in a separate place, at a separate hour, under a separate form, but dissolves into daily life as smoke dissolves into air, quiet yet everywhere. So that a child watches how a hand holds a tool, watches how someone sits close enough to fire to feel warmth without touching coals, watches what is past, what is kept, what may be picked up and what must be avoided, and from such small observations, almost invisible, an early understanding begins to form, not yet named, not yet spoken, yet already settling into the body, into the gaze, into the hesitant rhythm of hands becoming familiar. And what is more striking is that learning does not move only from adults to children, for if it did, the picture would remain incomplete, missing its most subtle and powerful current, the flow of knowledge from child to child, carried in small footsteps, in awkward attempts, in mistakes corrected within play, so that the true figures here are no longer children as a vague mass behind life, but the older child leaning toward the younger, showing how to hold an object firmly, a small group gathering around a gesture both new and familiar, one child imitating another, the group together turning play into a miniature version of real labour, as though amid laughter, dust, and objects passed from hand to hand. Skill finds its way across generations without any formal beginning. In that world, play does not stand opposite labour as two separate realms, but becomes a soft threshold through which children enter skill without being thrown into the full weight of adulthood, where imitation becomes early practice, where pretending gradually becomes the ability to do, and thus observations among the Bayaka often suggest a very different image from modern expectations, that children may begin learning hunting-related gestures very early, around the age of 3, through aiming games, role play, through lighter tools used to recreate a world they will one day enter with their whole bodies, as though technique does not arrive in a single day, but little by little, through naive yet necessary drafts of childhood. Among the Hadza as well, children from about 5 to 14 do not remain within the camp as passive shadows outside the rhythm of life, but move between inside and outside spaces, participating in age-appropriate activities, learning to care for small parts of themselves, learning tasks, learning age-based divisions of work, so that a day is never merely time passing, but ground marked by the traces of observation, practice, and imitation, where adults may be near in sight or in hearing yet do not intervene constantly, for it is precisely that distance which creates the space for learning to occur, allowing an older child to show a younger how to tie, how to hold, how to sit still near fire, how to recognize what may be brought to the mouth and what must never be touched. And from these small movements, the entire camp emerges as a continuous learning environment, stretching across speech, objects, heat, scent, light, and repetition. If one steps further back, far back, into Ice Age Europe, to Kremswachtberg in Austria, a site of the Gravettian period some 27 to 30,000 years ago, another truth appears with almost unsettling clarity, that children were never absent from the prehistoric record, only that their traces rarely survive intact, and here, infant burials reveal a rare and profound presence, including a double burial showing the earliest known identical newborn twins identified through ancient DNA, alongside another infant of about 3 months, closely related, as though amid the vast cold of the Ice Age, among bone, earth, and time, that community left behind unmistakable evidence that children were present within relationships, within life, and within how humans faced the fragility of life at its very beginning. And perhaps it is here that the quietest question of the entire scene begins to surface, that if childhood always unfolded among fire, tools, play, other eyes, and other hands, then was play and learning ever truly spare time, ever truly outside real work? Or was it always the way real work prepared itself for tomorrow? For without children who observe, imitate, fail, and then teach one another, who would know how to keep fire through the night, how to process seeds, read tracks, divide food at the right moment, or act within a camp sustained by delicate coordination? And this may also be what distinguishes humans from many other beings, that our skills do not pass through generations by gene or instinct alone, but require time, presence, long cycles of observation and practice, a childhood long enough for knowledge to settle into the body before becoming habit, then ability, then something that feels almost natural. And so, when looking back upon a prehistoric day, what remains is not only the image of adults at work, but a gentler, deeper cycle, where children move through knowledge as through light and shadow, gathering fragments of technique without knowing they are holding the future of their community. And from there another question slowly unfolds, almost without effort, that if human childhood has always grown within a circle of many gazes, many hands, many voices, then who truly raises a child within the camp, a single mother, or the entire community surrounding them? If, within the same morning, some must leave the camp to gather more calories, while others sit at the edge of light separating seeds from their hard shells, while someone tends the embers so they do not fade, while another bends down to mend a frayed binding, then the simplest question becomes one that cannot be set aside: who watches the child? An infant cannot shift itself away from the cold ground, cannot turn from the heat of coals, cannot understand how dangerous the sharp stone lying beside its small hand truly is. A toddler, for all its restless motion, is more fragile than it appears, for a few unsteady steps are enough to bring it too close to fire, into shadow, or beyond the field of watch, as quietly as a pebble slipping from the edge of a slope. And so, if one looks closely, childcare was never a private matter between mother and child. It belonged to the infrastructure of life itself, quiet as water, as fire, as the slow warmth held within ash through the night. Among humans, the young remain vulnerable for far too long, needing far too much, taking far longer to stand on their own than in many other great primates, and so their care can rarely be placed entirely upon a single body. It is here that human life reveals a deeper distinction, for care does not flow only from mother to child, but from many directions, through many hands, across fragments of time that join into an almost continuous net of support. When the question of who watches the child is asked in its proper place, the scene changes at once. It is no longer only mother and child. The entire camp begins to enter. The mother remains, of course, the closest centre, especially in those first months when the child is bound to the rhythms of feeding and sleep, to the warmth of skin, to the familiar scent of the body that held it from the moment it entered the world. But to be the centre does not mean to carry the whole. A father may take the child when the mother needs both hands for food. An older brother or sister may guide the smaller one toward a safer space, offering a smooth stone, a small branch, a simple task enough to keep restless feet from wandering too near the fire. An elder woman, no longer travelling far, may hold the child while her eyes still follow the line of smoke. An aunt, an uncle, even someone within the camp not bound by blood but by shared meals, shared journeys, shared seasons of hunger and cold, may bend to lift a crying infant, or place into its hands a portion of softened, cooled food. This network is not an exception. This network is how the camp lives. Communities of hunter-gatherers observed in more recent times leave behind a clear image of this pattern. Around very young children, there are not only close kin, but also those who share the same camp without sharing blood, those within childbearing years, and those long beyond them. The circle of presence around a child is not a simple line from mother to child, but something closer to a knot of many threads, tightening, loosening, passing from hand to hand, yet rarely breaking. The closer one looks, the clearer it becomes that human childhood is not held up by a single arm, but by an entire field of presence gathered around it. Across an ordinary day, this network does not announce itself in grand gestures, but in small exchanges so quiet they nearly vanish. A group prepares to leave the camp, what they carry, how far they go, when they return. All of it matters, but before all of that, there is something more essential, though rarely spoken to whom the child is entrusted. One hand releases, another receives. One body departs, another settles nearer the warmth. An infant must be held close to an adult, to keep heat, to hear the rhythm of a heartbeat, to soften into stillness. A toddler must be drawn back when it leans toward the red glow of coals, when curiosity reaches for a sharp stone, when its steps drift toward the edge of activity. A slightly older child may already be given the smallest of tasks, not as labour, but because these tasks hold it within sight, keep it within the orbit of safety without taking from it the feeling of belonging. Care, then, was never only the act of holding. It was the sharing of softened food. It was the offering of one's time to the slowness of another. It was one half of the gaze fixed upon the work of the hands, while the other half remained quietly reserved for a small body unsteady near the fire. It was a shift change without words among those who understood they were together holding something that could not yet hold itself. In some places, blood ties shaped these patterns more strongly. In others, exchange, reciprocity, and the long memory of living side by side through seasons built rhythms of care no less enduring. And so this system took on a distinctly human form, not entirely like the collective rearing seen in other species, for here there was not only instinct, but relationship, memory, and trust, woven from countless repeated days. The deepest reason rests within the small being at the centre of this scene. Human young arrive unfinished. They require warmth for long stretches of time. They require food that must be processed. They must be shielded from fire, from sharp edges, from cold water, from uneven ground, from everything that to an adult is mere background, yet to them may mark the boundary between safety and harm. Their dependence extends so long that childhood becomes almost a distinct span of life, dense and prolonged, asking more than any single adult body could provide while still foraging, still moving, still sustaining the group through the shifting patterns of season, water, prey, and land. And so, many hands were not an ornament at the margins. Many hands were the condition that allowed a child to live long enough, warm enough, fed enough, safe enough, to grow within reach of shared knowledge. And when all these small acts are woven together, a quiet realization begins to take shape. Human society was not built only through hunting, through fire, through tools, but through the capacity of many to bend down toward the weakest bodies. A child learns because it is near others, but to be near, it must first be kept alive, kept warm, kept within the unbroken, though ever-shifting, embrace of the group. And so, a day in the camp was not only filled with material labour, but with social labour, soft enough to be overlooked, yet strong as the sinew that holds a structure in place. Look closely enough, and what keeps a human camp from collapsing is not only the food just brought back or the fire just tended, but the act of many taking turns to guard a life too young to guard itself. And from here, another question rises, as quietly as the first, yet no less real. If a community must divide so many hands simply to keep its children alive, calm, within the circle of safety, then within that same rhythm of effort, what else must be repaired, mended, arranged, before they realize it's time to lift this fragile life and carry it elsewhere? At midday, when the fire has been kept from fading, when enough food has been gathered to push back immediate hunger, when the sharp urgency of morning has settled like water smoothing after a brief wind, the camp does not enter rest, but another form of labour, quieter, slower, yet no less necessary. For a mobile dwelling can continue only if what has not yet broken is repaired before it truly fails. if what has not yet fallen apart is held together before it truly comes undone. A blade dulled from yesterday, a binding worn thin from dampness, a wooden handle beginning to loosen from its join, a cover sagging under the weight of night wind, a sleeping ground scattered with fragments, a patch of earth near the fire still mixed with old ash and sharp bone or stone. All of these are small, so small that at a glance they may seem unworthy of concern. And yet it is these small things that slow the day to come, that cause a hand to slip at the moment it must hold firm, that turn a brief rain into a colder night than it needed to be, that loosen the order of the camp little by little, like a cord soaking through with water. Perhaps this is what an ancient site by a great lake in the region of Galilee suggests most clearly, not the image of a random stopping place, but of a dwelling already divided into zones of fire, of work, of sleep drawn close to shelter, as though even more than 23,000 years ago, to dwell was no longer simply to remain somewhere and let space arrange itself, but to shape a physical order strong enough to hold bodies, to hold objects, to hold fire, to hold the rhythm of living from dispersing. Home, if it may be called that, was never only a place. It was already a way of placing things where they must be, so that the day could continue. And once a dwelling takes on the form of order, midday can no longer be an empty space between foraging and sleep. It becomes the hour when the camp quietly mends itself. Someone crouches low, holding a piece of stone in the palm, trimming its edge with short, steady, patient motions, as though shaving time itself back into shape. Someone adjusts a handle, tightens a binding, replaces what has worn through, knowing that a loose joint today may become a greater risk tomorrow. Someone pulls a sagging cover taut again, secures its supports, clears damp debris from the sleeping place, tidies the ground around the hearth so that it returns to clarity. For the fire is not only a place of cooking, but a small centre around which the rhythm of life turns, where disorder spreads easily, like ash caught by the wind, rising from ground into habit, and from habit into carelessness. Elsewhere, someone is not repairing anything in the hand, but something less visible, the way the camp reads the world around it. They remember where water still flows, which patch of growth once held fruit, which ground has lately shown fewer animal tracks, how far one must now walk to gather dry wood. They look not to admire but to weigh. How much remains here that can still be used for a few more days? How much has already begun to thin, like the early afternoon light slipping from the edge of land? And so the midday question is not always spoken, yet it lingers within many glances, within many silences. Is it still worth staying? Among mobile hunter-gatherer groups in Eastern Africa, a temporary camp often marks only a short segment within a long life, where the number of people may shift as some arrive, others leave, as nearby resources grow sparse, as 6 or 8 weeks pass, and the ease of staying begins to give way to the need to move. And so the maintenance of a camp is never separate from the question of departure. To repair a shelter is not only to repair a shelter, it is also to answer whether it is worth keeping for a few more days. To tighten a handle is not only preparation for its next use, it is also a way of delaying or preparing for the journey ahead. There is no single commanding voice, no hand pointing to the ground that instantly changes the course of all things. There is a small group looking together at the same reality, measuring within their minds things that cannot be precisely counted, such as effort, distance, fatigue, what may be lost by leaving, what may be lost by staying. Some continue to bend over their tools, lifting each small piece as though gathering errors before they can become harm. A stone edge is reshaped, a binding is pulled tight, a worn part is replaced. A sleeping ground is arranged again so that the night to come does not meet the body with discomfort and damp cold. The space around the hearth is cleared so that the fire remains a centre of order rather than a point from which disorder spreads. Alongside these movements of the hand runs a chain of silent evaluation. No less weighty than any spoken decision is water still near and safe. Is dry wood still easy to find? Is the small food nearby still enough to sustain a gentle rhythm for a few more days? Or has staying begun to cost more than leaving? Perhaps this is the deeper nature of mobility, not movement born of restlessness, but movement as a repeated logic, where resources, tools, bodies, relationships, all wind together like cords holding a single bundle. And here, an idea begins to emerge, slowly, like the shape of a dwelling rising from the ash once the thin veil of smoke has cleared. The home of prehistoric humans may never have been a fixed thing. It was an order that could be taken apart, carried, rebuilt, and sustained again elsewhere. Such a dwelling was not primitive in the sense of being unstructured. On the contrary, it demanded a far subtler capacity to create stability from what is temporary, to decide where fire belongs, where sleep belongs, where work belongs, to hold that order for just enough time, and then to leave it at the moment before attachment to place becomes a burden upon survival itself. To stay and to move, seen closely, are not opposites. They are two rhythms of the same skill, one to hold, one to release, one to gather, one to open. You stay long enough for a place to become a home. You leave at the right moment so that home does not become what holds you back. And yet an order that can be taken apart and carried only truly works when it accounts not only for objects, but for bodies. For each time a camp considers whether to remain or to leave. The question is never only how much wood remains, how much water, how much food. The question is also who can move quickly, who will move slowly, who is in pain, who has grown weak, who must be waited for, who must be carried within a rhythm of movement that is not always light. At that point, mobility is no longer a matter of distance alone, but a matter of attachment, of responsibility, of how fully a community wishes to remain whole when the bodies within it no longer share the same strength, the same pace, the same endurance. And so, in the quiet light of early afternoon, when the camp has just held itself back from unravelling, a thin tension still lingers in the air, like a cord that has been tightened, yet must still be tested once more by hand. Everything may last a few more days. Everything may also need to be carried sooner than expected. But perhaps the hardest part is not rebuilding a dwelling elsewhere. Perhaps the hardest part is how to move together, when not every body can still keep pace with the movement of the camp. What did they do with those who could no longer move fast enough to follow? If one could no longer walk out to gather, then who fed them? Who carried back the portion already prepared to where they lay? Who kept them close to the fire as night descended? Who slowed their own steps so the rhythm of the group would not leave them behind? The question seems small, almost like a marginal detail in a foraging camp, Yet when it is held long enough, it begins to alter the entire tone of prehistoric life, because from this point onward, what matters is no longer who is stronger, who travels farther, who throws with greater precision, but who gives time, who shares portions, who carries the burden of another in those days when a body can no longer sustain itself. Perhaps it is here, beneath all familiar images of strength and efficiency, that another logic has always existed, not survival as display, but survival as a quiet network of care, where food, warmth, strength, and time move from one person to another so that life does not break. The grand explanations of human society often return to this point, that humans endure not only through self-reliance, but by being carried, being fed, being waited for, being helped through the weaker passages of existence. And as that question lingers, the layers of the story begin to emerge, the living who have grown weak, the survivors of severe injury, and then those who have died. In northern Iraq, within Shanidar Cave, that story appears not as a clear answer, but as a dense field of shadow, where debates about Neanderthals have stretched across decades. The site is known for the idea that the dead may once have been laid down with flowers, yet what gives Shanidar its weight is not a settled image of beauty, but its uncertainty. For pollen surrounding a skeleton need not arise from deliberate ritual alone. It may just as easily have come with the wind, from burrowing animals, from plants slowly entering the cave over vast stretches of time. And so Shanidar resists becoming a simple proof of a gentle past. Instead, it compels a deeper question. How were those no longer strong treated? How much patience did a group extend to the injured? And within stone, dust, shadow, and time, was there a pause, however brief, in which the living remained long enough to care for the weak and to stay beside the dead? That is where Shanidar grows heavy, not in certainty, but in the realization it presses upon us that even in distant prehistory, physical strength may never have been the whole story. From Shanidar, the question deepens at La Ferracie in southwestern France, where the debate reaches not only adults, but a Neanderthal child who died very young. The case known as La Ferracie 8 quiets everything, for when the subject of loss is a small body, the discussion of burial ceases to be merely technical and becomes almost unavoidable. What does a group do when a child no longer breathes? Recent studies suggest strong indications that the body was placed into a deliberately dug pit, yet even here, caution remains necessary. For Neanderthal burial is still a contested field, unresolved, not yet capable of becoming an easy conclusion. And it is precisely this openness that deepens the scene. For what emerges is not a fully deciphered ritual, but an image of a camp forced to pause its daily rhythm, to hold a space of silence, to touch the body, to decide where to lay it, and to return afterward to the absence that loss leaves behind. In that moment, prehistory no longer appears as an uninterrupted flow of hunting and movement, but as a life that knows how to stop, how to endure, how to give time to grief. And then, in Borneo, some 31,000 years ago, a piece of evidence emerges from human bone itself, so striking that it shifts the entire tone of this story. A young individual, missing the lower part of the left leg, likely amputated in childhood, and yet the true weight lies not in the injury itself, but in the years that followed, at least 6 to 9 more years of life. To live for years in a foraging environment with a missing limb is not something a solitary body could accomplish. It requires someone to bring food, someone to assist movement, someone to slow the pace, someone to reshape the rhythm of the group around a person who can no longer keep up as before. The very act of such early amputation suggests a considerable understanding of the body, of controlling bleeding, of preventing infection from swiftly taking life. Yet beyond all speculation of technique stands a profoundly human truth, that once the wound closed, the long years that followed could only exist if the community continued to sustain that individual, day after day, season after season, movement after movement. Care here is no longer a soft gesture or a fleeting moment of compassion. It is sustained collective labour. It is the quiet persistence through which a group delays death. When Shanidar, La Ferrasi, and Borneo are placed side by side, prehistory begins to unfold more slowly, more heavily, yet also more human. A single day in ancient life did not contain only hunting, fire, food, and movement, but also the keeping of the injured near camp, near warmth, near softened or shared food, the slowing of an entire group for a body that cannot move quickly, the silence held for the dead and for those who remain. Perhaps this is the deepest shift in perception, that human life has never been merely the beating of a heart or the filling of a stomach, but the sustaining of belonging, even when a body is no longer immediately useful. To live, in that sense, is not only to prolong flesh, but to extend connection, to remain beside one another, to preserve meaning beyond productivity. And if humans could give time to the weak, to the dead, to the pause that follows loss, then might it be that from very early on, they also gave time to things that do not directly feed the body, to colour, to signs, to memory, to those quiet meanings that only a species capable of staying together would patiently hold. If a day is already filled with fire, with food, with children, with the weak, with everything that pulls the body toward its most urgent needs, then why is there still space for something that gives no calories, that does not shield from rain, that does not directly keep one warm? The question is small, and yet it opens into something deep. For from here human life no longer appears merely as a sequence of actions to avoid hunger and cold, but as a place somewhere between the hand, memory, and the sense of belonging, where a trace of red upon the skin, a fragment marked with lines, a small shell carried far from the sea, begins to speak in a language that does not feed the body, yet nourishes something no less real. The earliest evidence of this world does not begin with grand scenes. It begins with small things, objects that can be held, ground, mixed, worn, left upon the skin, as though meaning in human history did not arrive like thunder, but as the lightest marks near the fingertips. One of the clearest places where this emerges lies along the southern coast of Africa, where red was not only found, but worked. Within that cave, fragments of red ochre engraved around 77,000 years ago bear repeated, deliberate lines, regular enough to resist dismissal as accident, restrained enough to suggest a mind already engaged with form, with rhythm, with sign. Yet what makes this place even more remarkable lies deeper in time, around 100,000 years ago, when people there did not merely hold a striking piece of colour, but ground, mixed, stored, and preserved a pigment-rich compound within 2 abalone shells, alongside bone, charcoal, crushed stone, and hammer stones, forming what appears to be a complete toolkit for processing colour. This changes the way we see that red substance. It is no longer a visually appealing object picked from nature. It has become something to be sourced, worked, transformed through time and action. It may have served technology, skin protection, bodily marking, decoration of objects, or layers of meaning now lost to us as distant echoes. Yet whatever its precise function, one thing becomes quietly clear, that here existed a form of labour that did not end at sustaining the body. Someone once sat, grinding that red powder, mixing it, storing it, preserving it, as though amid the heaviest demands of survival, there remained space for work that required concentration of mind, endurance of memory, and perhaps the sense that colour itself carried something beyond the purely material. From that red close at hand, the story extends to other small objects that cannot feed a body, yet can sustain an identity. In the Levant and North Africa, perforated marine shells reveal that from very early on, humans selected, carried, pierced, and wore items from the sea as social signals. Some beads found at school in Israel and at Wed Jibana in Algeria show that they did not simply lie within living spaces as ready-made ornaments. They had to be chosen, transported from the coast, adapted through existing openings or modified to be strung and worn. Further west, at Bismoon Cave in Morocco, discoveries push the age of such shell beads back to at least around 142,000 years, rendering the emergence of personal and social markers far older than once imagined. Imagine a hand holding a tiny shell, turning it in the light, finding the opening, threading it, wearing it. The act produces no food, it does not burn away the night, yet it consumes time, attention. Selection, a measure of patience, and a quiet sense of who one is, to whom one belongs, how one wishes to be seen by others. Perhaps it is in such small, seemingly insignificant objects that humans first placed upon their bodies the signs of relationship, of memory, of belonging. From the engraved lines upon red and the shells worn upon the body, the symbolic world extends further, not only into what can be seen, but into what can be heard. At Hohlefels in southern Germany, flutes made from bone and ivory, dating to around 35,000 years ago, suggest that when modern humans entered Europe, they carried not only tools of hunting or knowledge of fire, but also a well-formed musical tradition. The mere existence of such instruments speaks volumes. A flute does not arise by itself from bone. It requires crafted hands, knowledge of material, the guiding of breath through hollow space in a precise way, an ear capable of distinguishing between meaningless sound and tones that can be repeated, shared. That sound does not fill the stomach, it does not raise a shelter, yet it fills the space between people sitting close in darkness, as fire fills space with light. And here we begin to sense that symbolic labour does not reside only in marks left upon skin or object, but also in something far more intangible, something born and dissolved in air, yet still able to bind many bodies into a shared rhythm of feeling. When these non-caloric objects are placed side by side, from ochre processed and stored in southern Africa around 100,000 years ago, to engraved red fragments around 77,000 years ago, to shell beads in the Levant, Algeria, and Morocco from over 100,000 to at least 142,000 years ago, and then to flute sounds in Germany around 35,000 years ago, a larger question becomes difficult to avoid. If humans devoted time to what cannot be eaten, burned, or used as shelter, then had their days already moved beyond raw survival far earlier than we imagine? Perhaps the answer is quieter than expected. Humans did not only maintain biological life, they worked with identity, with memory, with the group, with signs that prevent an individual from dissolving into the night as a solitary body. A trace of red, a shell bead, an engraved line, a breath through a hollow bone, all share something in common. They require time, attention, action, and memory, while not directly solving hunger, cold, or rain. And so, by the end of the day, what sustains a group may not lie solely in what they eat or what they burn, but also in invisible rules, in signs of belonging, in objects that carry shared meaning. And if that is so, then does what keeps a community alive reside only in food and fire, or also in those unseen structures that determine who shares with whom, who is allowed to speak, and who is drawn back when they drift too far? Late afternoon always carries a different kind of light, no longer the sharp cold of early morning, not yet the full descent of darkness, but a threshold where everything done throughout the day begins to take form before the eyes, where it becomes possible to see who has brought what back, who walks more slowly from fatigue, who sits down first from exhaustion, who needs to be given a share first, who is already thinking of leaving, who wishes to remain one more night. And it is precisely at this hour that the most fragile element of the camp no longer lies at the edge of the grass or within the tracks of animals, but among the people seated close to one another. There is food now, but is that enough to bring stability? Perhaps not, for a group may have meat, roots, seeds, fire, and still remain uneasy if it lacks the soft rules that keep distribution from tilting too far to one side, that prevent accumulation from exceeding its bounds, that ensure no single individual grows so prominent that the rest begin to fade into their shadow. In many hunter-gatherer communities, cooperation does not appear as an abstract virtue, but as a living architecture, an invisible structure that holds people together even as risk remains ever present. These networks do not scatter at random. They tend to gather into clusters, where cooperation invites further cooperation, where the way a camp behaves today may shape the pattern of relationships tomorrow. And so, when the resources of a day are laid out in plain sight, late afternoon becomes something else as well, quieter, more difficult to name. It is the moment when the economy of a day slowly turns into its politics. From that point on, the central figure is no longer only the one who has brought food back. There is reputation, moving silently through glances. There are murmurs not yet spoken aloud. There is restraint, as thin as smoke, yet without it, a simple act of sharing can easily become the seed of resentment. The one who brings meat, especially meat that carries high value in sharing, will naturally draw attention. Every gaze touches them first. But what is striking is that, in many such societies, the moment of greatest attention is also the moment requiring the greatest caution. Too much pride, too much display, too strong a desire to convert success into lasting power. All may encounter subtle forces that pull back. A remark half in jest, a laugh that lingers just a little too long, a retelling that makes the achievement seem smaller. not because the group lacks gratitude, but because it understands that excessive prominence, if left unsoftened, may become the first fracture. Beside them are those with social voice, not necessarily the strongest, nor the ones who command the most, but those who know how to place the right words at the right moment. They may soften the tone of a conversation, remind gently of a boundary without turning it into humiliation, or keep irritation from growing into conflict. They do not stand above the rest as singular leaders. They resemble a balancing force, a quiet weight placed at the center to keep the scale from tipping too far. And then there are those less visible, those who do not bring back the largest share, who do not speak the most, who are not named the most. It is through them that a deeper truth becomes clear. A camp does not stand because of its most capable individual. It stands because the many still choose to remain together. In that world, rumour has a life of its own. Reputation may move ahead of a person faster than their steps. A brief account of how someone shared yesterday, a remark about who tends to keep the better portion, a passing comment about one who boasts too much, all gather into a form of power that is invisible yet real. Gossip is not merely a voice at the margins. It can shape who is trusted, who is chosen for cooperation, who is listened to, who is watched with caution. Perhaps that is why, in many hunter-gatherer societies, such talk is not access to daily life. It lies close to its center, like an underground current regulating reputation, behavior, and the limits of what is acceptable. And so, late afternoon here is not only the time of sharing food, it is the time when the camp reads itself, watches itself, listens to itself, measures itself, a gaze that lingers a little longer on the meat someone holds, a quiet reminder directed at one who has spoken too much of their own effort, a small silence, just enough for someone to understand that their wish to move camp is not fully supported. These things may be brief, light, almost too slight to be called events, yet they are the true labour of social life. Sharing meat, sharing effort, sharing the care of children are not simply acts of kindness. They are ways of reducing risk in a life where uncertainty can arrive at any moment. They ensure that one person's hunger does not remain an isolated condition, but becomes a matter of the group. They keep exhaustion from being abandoned. They prevent burdens from settling endlessly on weaker shoulders. Even the question of whether to move camp, which at first glance seems an ecological calculation, shifts its form by late afternoon. It is no longer simply about whether food remains here, whether water is near, whether tracks are plentiful. It becomes a social question. Who wishes to leave? Who wishes to stay? Who will bear more if movement begins? Who is weaker and may struggle to keep pace? Who is hungrier? Who is more prone to anger after a long day? Who speaks too much? Who remains too silent? Who is accumulating too much prestige? Who needs to eat first so that tomorrow may still unfold? In this world, the management of emotion is not an abstraction. It is labour. It is work that must be done, even if it is never named. For if a quiet resentment is left to linger across days, it may grow like embers beneath ash, until one day it burns hot enough to fracture the group itself. To understand how a band composed of many who are not close kin can remain intact, one must look deeper into this rare social structure. In many studied foraging societies, Most individuals living together in a residential group are not closely related by blood. This is notable when compared to other primates, where kinship often plays a far greater role in structuring collective life. Another equally important feature is the more balanced influence between men and women in decisions of residence. When decision-making does not tilt rigidly toward one side, groups tend to form more open networks, with lower concentrations of close kin, broader and more flexible social ties. Such a structure, in turn, supports long-term cooperation and the accumulation of culture over time. Yet a structure like this endures only when accompanied by norms that are soft enough to avoid constant force, yet strong enough to limit favoritism, to draw back those who boast, to regulate distribution, to prevent power from hardening into a dominant branch. By now, the real question is no longer who hunted what. It is who keeps the group from coming apart. There may still be food in a day, yet a camp may already begin to decay from within if it lacks this invisible layer of labour, sharing, restraint, the softening of prominence, keeping reputation within tolerable bounds, allowing the community to adjust the individual through gentle but continuous pressure. None of these stand at the margins of life. They are the conditions that allow the camp to continue as a unit of cooperation, as a many-bodied organism not yet torn apart by ego, bias, or accumulated discontent. As darkness lowers, the tensions of the day do not truly disappear. They change state, less sharp, less direct, wider, softer, as if dissolved into the small circle of firelight. Within that circle, what was not fully spoken in the afternoon may transform into story, into memory, into speculation, into worlds that only open once the night has grown deep enough. As the last light of afternoon withdraws beyond the horizon, the colours of the world do not vanish at once but settle, as if the day were being folded layer by layer in slow succession, until only a small circle of light remains around the fire, where bodies no longer spread outward in many directions but draw closer together, close enough to see the fire touch the face, close enough that the surrounding darkness becomes a ring of silence enclosing every word. The fire does not banish the night entirely. It only opens a narrow field of sight, where light and shadow coexist, where things appear and recede, where speech no longer needs to cross wide distances as in the day, but moves within a circle of warmth. Could it be that as the day contracts into a small circle of light, speech itself begins to change, becoming softer in sound yet wider in reach in ways that are difficult to measure? At that subtle threshold, something else begins to emerge, not from the light itself but from the way humans use the time that has just been extended. When one compares the countless conversations that unfold under the sun with those that gather around the fire, the difference lies not in the quantity of words but in their direction. By day, speech clings to what is nearest, most immediate, what must be resolved, what must be adjusted so that the day may continue. But when night arrives, when fire draws the world inward, speech loosens from the present, it begins to open, it travels farther, it touches those who are absent, places not before the eyes, memories that have receded, possibilities that have never occurred. Could it be that at that moment, speech is no longer only a tool for maintaining order, but becomes a way of expanding that order into a world of greater meaning? As the function of speech shifts, so too do the roles of those gathered around the fire. There is no clear commander, no fixed centre of power. One person begins a story, perhaps with only a small detail, a fading memory, a name recalled. Another joins in, gently correcting, adding a fragment, linking to another memory, as though the story belongs not to any single individual, but to the shared current of remembrance. Some listen, not merely for entertainment, but to learn how a community remembers, how experience is held through words, how a way of living is carried within a story rather than imposed directly. Children sit closer, not because they fully understand what is told, but because they are learning how to understand, learning how to listen, learning that the world is preserved not only through action, but through memory. Fire stands at the centre of all this, not only as heat, not only as light, but as a social structure shaped from matter itself. It extends the evening, yet more importantly, it creates a span of time in which people can remain together without being pulled away by urgent tasks. Perhaps it is within this span that distinctly human forms of communication become most visible, where telling, listening, remembering, and imagining weave together without immediate purpose. Could it be that fire has done more than keep the body warm, that it has given the mind space to open? What is seen by day begins to change form as it enters the night. An animal is no longer only something to hunt or avoid. It may become a figure in an older story, carrying meaning beyond the moment of encounter. A place is no longer only a point along a path. It may become a field of memory, a warning, a story retold to preserve a necessary distance. A death does not end at loss. It may become a boundary, a lesson, a part of collective memory carried across many retellings. Could it be that within these story, symbolic layers, ecological knowledge, and rules of living all merge, no longer separate, but existing in a form easier to remember, easier to pass on? Night around the fire is therefore not merely an extension of the day. It is another mode of living where rhythm changes, where speech no longer serves immediate survival, but begins to serve understanding, remembering, imagining. Other sounds arise as well, not only words, but rhythm, song, movements that take on ritual form, as if the body itself participates in storytelling in its own way. Could it be that within this space, social order is not imposed but softened, felt, shared through common experience? From all of this, a larger question slowly emerges, no longer about the content of stories, but about the time that allows them to exist at all. What has fire done to the human evening? Could it be that within that small circle of light, humans have not only extended their waking hours, but opened another mode of being, where memory may be told, where assumptions may be explored, where a shared world is formed not through action, but through story? Perhaps the human evening does not begin with sleep immediately after work is done. It stretches a little further, a little to tell, a little to listen, a little to remain within a fading light. And then, when the final stories settle, when embers still glow but voices have softened, what remains may not be only sleep, but a particular way of existing within the dark, within the diminishing warmth, within the slow rhythm of the natural world. The voices lower, slowly, like a thin strand of smoke that does not vanish at once but thins into the night air as it begins to slow. The stories by the fire no longer needing an ending, only needing to be left undisturbed so they may fade on their own, and then a few bodies begin to shift, adjusting the ground beneath them, drawing children a little closer, close to the last traces of warmth, farther from the dark that is quietly spreading at the edge of the camp, as though each small distance carries a meaning the body has long since learned without words. But is dusk truly a signal for everything to stop at once? Does sleep descend the moment the sun falls, like a blanket drawn over the world? The truth moves more slowly, more gently. There's another layer of wakefulness that lingers after the meal, after the firelight, a quieter wakefulness, with fewer words, where the eyes remain open, the ears still listening, the body still feeling the heat retreating from the ground. And within those few stretched hours, sleep has not yet arrived, as though it must be invited in gradually, rather than summoned by a single signal. If that layer exists, then night is not a switch. It does not turn cleanly between waking and sleep. It flows. It extends. It guides the body through an in-between space where consciousness does not vanish, but slowly withdraws, step by step, in rhythm with the surrounding world. And that raises another question, whether humans sleep in its natural form, without artificial light, without clocks, without imposed schedules, is truly longer, deeper, more separate than what we know today, as so many familiar images seem to suggest. What has been observed in communities living beyond industrial rhythms reveals something else. Not dramatic, not extreme, but unexpectedly familiar. Sleep duration often falls within a moderate range, not excessively long, not markedly different from many modern societies. A night's sleep may gather into 6 or 7 hours, sometimes little less, sometimes little more, but rarely reaching the imagined lengths of a single uninterrupted stretch filling most of the night. Daytime rest appears, but not so regularly as to define the rhythm of every day. The strongest light is not at midday, but in the morning, when the body opens with the rising light, while at night it is the gradual drop in temperature that draws sleep closer. Could it be that before electricity, the human body learned to listen more to temperature than to darkness? Could it be that sleep comes not simply because night has fallen, but because the air has cooled enough for the body to release its hold? Another idea, often repeated, that sleep in earlier times was divided into distinct segments, does not emerge here as a universal rule. Instead, sleep appears as a relatively contained span within the night, even if the exact moment of its beginning shifts slightly from day to day. And that softens yet another image, that pre-industrial humans lived in a long, fragmented sleep, as though the night were always broken into separate parts. Reality seems simpler. One night, one period of sleep, a rhythm that holds, more often than not. But if data can quiet the myths, the feeling of night remains something else entirely, a space in which humans do not only sleep, but live. A person draws their bedding closer, shifting nearer to the fire, just enough to keep warm without the heat becoming too much. A child is pulled inward toward a larger body, as a reflex that requires no thought. A few brief words remain, no longer stories, only the final exchanges before silence fully arrives. And then the sounds of night begin to fill the space that opens. Wind moves lightly across small things. Insects form a faint and constant vibration. Branches touch in the dark, from time to time. A distant sound may be the passing steps of something at the edge of the living space. Embers crackle softly, holding a rhythm that preserves a trace of light within the dark. Darkness here is not only a threat, it is part of a cycle. It is something the body has learned to know. The temperature lowers, slowly, not abruptly, but at a pace the body can follow, as though an unseen hand is easing life down to its most minimal rhythm. There are nights that are brighter, when moonlight outlines the edges of things. There are nights that are warmer, when sleep arrives a little later. But the central axis remains unchanged. Temperature, light, their shifting balance. Could it be that these small variations shape sleep more deeply than any fixed rule? At this point, the two extreme images of night begin to lose their weight. There is no clear evidence for an endless stretch of sleep, wholly different from the present. But there is also no sign that every night was a tense vigil, with people forced to remain awake in constant watch for danger. Instead, a quiet layer of wakefulness follows the stories. Then sleep arrives later than dusk, not as long as imagined, yet enough for the body to recover, and morning comes with a steady rhythm, often near the edge of dawn, as though the body has aligned itself with light rather than resisted it. Night, in this sense, is not an empty space between days. It is the closing arc of a circle. Perhaps what matters is not how long they slept, but how they remained within the night. They did not only fear the dark, they were accustomed to it. They listened to it. They adjusted to it. Night is not only rest, it is another state of life, where large movements cease, but small connections between body and environment continue, quietly, steadily, and when everything settles until only warmth, breath, and a faint glow beneath ash remain, a question no longer feels distant. If each day is held together by such small things, from morning to midday, from afternoon to evening, into the night, then what is truly being held in place? And could it be that an entire day, in its fullest form, is nothing more than a prolonged effort to keep a fragile world from falling into complete silence? Perhaps the question from the beginning was never what grand things they did throughout the day, because if we wait only for pursuit, for confrontation, for victory, then we have looked at human history as one looks at a flash of lightning, forgetting the wider night sky that allows that flash to exist at all. And what emerges, in the end, is not a heroic schedule, but a fragile structure of maintenance, where each small act connects to another, where embers must be kept alive through cold winds, where each small unit of energy must arrive steadily, like slow drops feeding an unseen root, where tools must not break at the wrong moment, where roots, seeds, leaves, and stems must be transformed from what cannot be eaten into what the body can accept, where children must grow close enough to knowledge to learn without instruction, where the vulnerable must remain within reach of care so they do not fall out of the rhythm of the group, where discontent must be softened before it fractures into division, where memory must pass through the darkness around the fire and remain warm by morning, and where, finally, the body itself must be returned to darkness, to falling temperature, to the natural rhythm of sleep that existed long before any city came into being. If the question must be asked again, perhaps we no longer ask what they did all day, but how they kept a small world from collapse. And when the question shifts in that way, the day itself begins to change shape. It is no longer a scattering of fragments, no longer a set of isolated scenes cut apart, but begins to close into a circle, a slow, enclosed, enduring circle, in which each part of time quietly supports the next. Morning begins with fire, not only as a convenience, but as the condition that allows the day to exist at all. Very early on, in a cave in southern Africa nearly 1 million years ago, traces of burning in place suggest that the control of fire was not a late invention of comfort, but a deep turning point in human behaviour, as though from that moment, the human day was no longer entirely surrendered to cold, darkness, and chance. Daytime, when seen more closely, does not appear as a sequence of triumphs. It moves more like a steady flow of energy, hands preparing food, repairing tools, mending what has broken, restoring what has shifted, keeping the living space usable. Keeping the rhythm from breaking, while children grow within that field of activity, learning through sight, through touch, through imitation, by standing close enough for knowledge to settle into them like warmth into skin. Toward afternoon and evening, it becomes clear that such a life is not sustained by food alone, but by softer mechanisms, systems of sharing, delicate balances of power, reputations built not only on what one can take, but on how one gives. Many hunter-gatherer communities show bonds within camps that are not defined solely by close kinship, and a balance between genders in decisions about residence and shared life that is greater than we often imagine of the past, as though human society expanded not only through technique, but through the ability to live together without crushing one another. As evening falls, fire extends the day once more, not through heavy labour, but through speech, through memory, through conversations in flickering light that make night not merely the remainder after work, but another social space, deeper, softer. And then night comes, and the body returns to darkness, to temperature, to the natural rhythm of sleep, not separate from the world, but settling within it. But perhaps more important still is that this circle is not held by a single individual. The true figure is never only the hunter, the fire keeper, or the storyteller. The true figure is the community itself, the one who keeps embers alive into the morning, the one who brings steady sources of food without noise or spectacle, the one who softens seeds and roots, the one who repairs the spear tip, the one who mends the shelter before the rain arrives, the child who learns by watching and playing, the one who carries the child, the one who tends the injured, the one who speaks softly by the fire when darkness has gathered at the edges of light, and alongside them are figures without faces, yet decisive in all things: time, memory, repetition, fragility. Time is what wears everything down. Memory is what resists that erosion. Repetition is how a group turns uncertainty into something that can be relied upon. Fragility is the background against which every gesture exists. A reminder that if a few links loosen, the entire structure may begin to fracture. From a small fire, one can draw out hundreds of thousands of years of human history, and then return again to a single hand turning a piece of wood, a child sitting close enough to listen, a night story passing through memory like a seed carried by the wind. Even in modern hunter-gatherer communities, night shows that fire does not merely extend waking hours, but opens a space where imagination, relationships, and memory can be rearranged into place, as though humans do not live by daylight alone, but are completed by the speaking hours of the dark. When all these figures stand within the same circle, what emerges is not the strength of exception, but the strength of the ordinary repeated long enough and well enough. And perhaps that is the quietest realization of this entire journey. What early humans did all day was not a series of adventures, but a series of small acts accumulating into civilization. It is precisely those slow, steady, repetitive acts, seemingly uneventful, that made it possible for tools to improve, for networks of cooperation to expand, for cultural memory to avoid rupture, for tradition not to dissolve when one generation fades, for human society to grow more complex while preserving its shared core. Fire opened a profound turning point not only because it warmed or cooked, but because it carried with it time, order, a measure of safety, and from there, new forms of mind and community. The structure of the band extended cooperation beyond blood ties, through the ways humans learned to share, to negotiate, to remain close without losing balance. Stories told in firelight did not merely soften the night, but widen the space of memory, tradition, imagination, the very materials that would later become cumulative culture. And so the foundation of human life may never have rested in exceptional moments. It rests in the ordinary repeated long enough, shared widely enough, aligned closely enough, that a single day, seemingly small, can quietly support the weight of history above it. And when that image nears its completion, what remains is not a closed answer, but a silence wide enough for thought to move beyond the story itself. If most of human history has truly been built from such days, days of keeping fire, keeping food, keeping knowledge, keeping relationships, keeping sleep, moving through darkness without breaking from the world, then has what makes us human ever truly lain in heroic moments? Or has it always rested in the ability to repeat ordinary acts together until they begin to resemble something almost cosmic? Perhaps the greatest things in human history have never arrived as thunder. Perhaps they have always been built slowly, from small gestures, familiar rhythms, unnamed acts, after the story, after the fire, after a day held together against collapse. Humans do not disappear from the world. They simply settle into it, like embers beneath ash, like warmth held within stone, like a thin yet enduring memory passing through the night, waiting for another morning to begin again.